The boy sat at the edge of the hatch with his dog while snow piled 3 feet high against the cabin walls, and the temperature outside dropped to 40 degrees below zero. Inside the chamber beneath his feet, where everyone said he had wasted an entire summer digging his own grave, the air held steady at 52 degrees without a single log burning. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories of frontier survival move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's tale is even more impossible than this one. The fire had gone out some time after midnight. Caddock Pritchard woke to his own breath hanging visible in the darkness of the cabin, each exhale a small cloud that disappeared into the frozen air. He was 14 years old, and in the 3 seconds it took him to fully wake, he knew something was terribly wrong. The cold was absolute. It pressed against his face like a physical thing, sharp and merciless. He reached for the extra bearskin his father always kept at the foot of the bed and found it already pulled up over both of them. That was when he realized his father had not been snoring. Caddock sat up. The movement took effort. His muscles were stiff from the cold that had seeped into the cabin during the night. He reached across the narrow space between their sleeping platforms and touched his father's shoulder. The body beneath the bearskin was rigid and cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. Caddock pulled his hand back. He did not call out. He did not shake his father. He simply sat there in the darkness, understanding with terrible clarity what had happened. Griffith Pritchard had survived 16 winters in the Rocky Mountains. He had trapped beaver from the Yellowstone to the Snake River. He had survived encounters with grizzlies, faced down hostile war parties, weathered blizzards that killed other men, and crossed frozen rivers that had claimed the lives of trappers with twice his experience. He had been competent, careful, and respected among the scattered community of mountainmen who worked the Northern Territories. And he had died because a fire went out on a cold night in February of 1836. Caddock climbed down from his sleeping platform and moved to the fireplace. The coals were completely dead, not even a hint of warmth remaining in the ash. He knelt and reached into the cold hearth, feeling for any ember that might have survived. Nothing. He had banked the fire himself before bed, exactly as his father had taught him. He had used the right wood, arranged the coals properly, left adequate ventilation. Everything had been done correctly. But fires were not machines. They were living things that sometimes simply died. And when they died in the deep cold of a mountain winter, people died with them. The cabin was small, perhaps 12 feet by 14 feet, built in the standard fashion of frontier construction. Logs notched at the corners, chinked with mud and moss, a single door, one small window covered with oiled rawhide, and a dirt floor. It had been adequate for his father and himself. It had kept out wind and rain. It had seemed sturdy enough. But now, standing in the pre-dawn darkness with his father's body cooling under bearskins and the temperature inside the cabin perhaps 20 degrees, Caddock understood something he had never fully grasped before. The cabin was not protection. It was just wood and mud arranged in a shape that slowed death down but could not stop it. Caddock buried his father on a hillside overlooking the creek where they had run their trap line together for 3 seasons. The ground was frozen 18 inches down, and it took him 2 days to dig deep enough. He worked alone. The nearest trapper was Emrys Powell, whose cabin sat 7 miles downstream, and Caddock did not want company for this. He wrapped his father's body in the best blankets they owned, placed Griffith's rifle and knife beside him, as was the custom, and covered the grave with stones to keep animals from digging. He marked the site with a wooden cross made from split pine and carved his father's name with a knife. Griffith Pritchard, born 1793, died February 1836, 43 years old. A good man who had done everything right and still died because warmth was more fragile than anyone wanted to admit. Caddock stood at the grave for a long time after the work was finished, not praying exactly, but thinking about fire and cold and the thin margin that separated living from dying in the mountains. When he returned to the cabin, he found it exactly as he had left it. His father's traps hung on the wall, his tools lay on the workbench, his spare clothes hung from pegs driven between the lies, the physical evidence of a life, all of it now belonging to a 14-year-old boy who had never run a trap line alone or spent a winter without his father's guidance. Caddock sat at the small table and considered his options with the methodical thinking Griffith had taught him. He could leave. There was a settlement at Fort Union, 3 weeks' travel east. He could sell his father's equipment, take whatever money it brought, and apprentice himself to a trader or merchant. It was what most people would expect. Mountain life was hard enough for grown men. A boy alone had almost no chance of surviving, particularly a boy who had just lost his father to the very conditions he would face. He could seek help from the scattered trapping community. Emrys Powell might take him on as a partner, though Emrys had made it clear on several occasions that he worked alone by preference. Idris Bevan, a former coal miner from Wales who had come west 5 years earlier, lived another 15 miles upriver and might be willing to teach him. Reese Cadwallader, the eldest trapper in the region at 57 years, had a large enough operation that he sometimes hired seasonal help. Or he could stay. He could run his father's trap line, maintain the cabin, and prove that he was capable of surviving what had killed a better man. The third option was probably foolish. It was certainly dangerous. But as Caddock sat in the cold cabin surrounded by his father's possessions, he realized the choice had already been made. He was not leaving. He was staying, and he was going to solve the problem that had taken his father's life. He was going to make sure that a failed fire would never kill anyone in this cabin again. Caddock had been 7 years old when his family left Wales. The memories of that life were fragmentary now, images without complete context, but some moments remained vivid. He remembered his father coming home from the mines, face black with coal dust, coughing into a rag that never came clean. He remembered the smell of the mining town, sulfur and smoke and damp stone. He remembered his mother, Branwen, who had died of fever the winter before they left for America, buried in ground so crowded with graves that the dead lay shoulder to shoulder beneath the chapel yard. But the memory that came to him now, sitting in the cold cabin 3 days after burying his father, was of the day Griffith had taken him down into the mine. It was not common practice to bring children below ground, but Griffith had wanted his son to understand the work that fed them. They had descended in the cage, dropping into darkness that swallowed the daylight, down through layers of earth and rock, until they reached the working level 200 feet below the surface. What Caddock remembered most clearly was the temperature. Outside it had been January, cold enough that ice formed on the inside of their cottage windows. But down in the mine, the air was warm, not fire warm, but steady and constant, a temperature that never changed regardless of what the weather did above ground. His father had explained it to him in simple terms. The earth holds its warmth, Griffith had said. Go deep enough, and it is always the same. Winter, summer, makes no difference. The ground keeps what heat it has. 7-year-old Caddock had not understood the significance. It was just an interesting fact, something to file away with other observations about how the world worked. But 14-year-old Caddock, sitting in a cabin where his father had frozen to death, understood it differently. Fire was unreliable. Fire required constant feeding, constant attention, constant fuel. Fire could go out. But the earth, the deep earth, held a warmth that never failed. He stood and walked to the corner where his father's books were kept. There were only 4 precious items that Griffith had brought from Wales and protected carefully. A Bible, a volume of Welsh poetry, a farmer's almanac from 1828, and a technical manual on mining engineering that Griffith had owned since his apprentice days. Caddock pulled out the mining manual and opened it to the section on ventilation and temperature management. The text was dense, written for educated engineers rather than common miners, but Griffith had taught Caddock to read well, and the boy worked through the pages slowly. The manual confirmed what his father had told him years ago. At depths below 6 feet, soil temperature remained relatively constant year-round, typically between 45 and 55 degrees depending on latitude and local conditions. The deeper you went, the more stable the temperature became. Caddock read the section 3 times, absorbing the implications. Then he closed the book and looked around the cabin with new eyes. The structure was built entirely above ground, exposed to every shift in temperature, every wind, every cold snap that blew down from the north. It fought against the weather with nothing but wood and mud and fire. But what if the cabin was not the answer? What if the answer was below the cabin, in the earth that never froze? The snow began melting in late March. Caddock had survived the remainder of winter by being obsessively careful with fire management. He woke twice each night to add wood to the fireplace. He kept 3 days' worth of split firewood inside the cabin at all times. He never let the coals die completely. It was exhausting and nerve-wracking, and it proved to him that relying on fire alone was not sustainable. As the weather warmed, he began traveling to other trappers' camps, not for social reasons, though he accepted the occasional meal and conversation, but to study how they built their root cellars. Most trappers did not bother with cellars, but those who stayed year-round often dug simple pits for storing potatoes, carrots, and other vegetables that needed cool conditions to keep through winter. Caddock examined every cellar he could find, noting depth, construction methods, and most importantly, temperature. Emrys Powell had a cellar 4 feet deep behind his cabin. Caddock asked permission to measure it and spent an afternoon taking notes. In early April, with snow still on the ground, but daytime temperatures climbing into the 40s, the cellar maintained a steady 48 degrees. Emrys thought the boy's interest was about food storage and gave him advice on keeping vegetables from rotting. Caddock thanked him and did not explain his actual purpose. Idris Bevan, the Welsh miner, had the most sophisticated cellar Caddock found. It was 8 feet deep, lined with stones, and accessed by a proper ladder. Bevan used it for storing furs during summer months when heat would damage the pelts. Caddock spent a full day helping Bevan organize his storage in exchange for permission to study the construction. The temperature at the bottom held steady at 51 degrees, and the stone lining kept the walls from collapsing while also preventing moisture from seeping through. Caddock also studied natural formations. He found animal dens, particularly bear dens, and examined how they were constructed. Bears dug into hillsides, creating chambers that took advantage of Earth's insulation. He found a family of foxes denning in a collapsed root system beneath a fallen tree. The den entrance was narrow, but the chamber inside was surprisingly large and noticeably warmer than the outside air. In May, he discovered an abandoned prospect hole from some long-gone miner who had been searching for gold or silver. The hole went down 12 feet before hitting bedrock. Caddock climbed down with a rope and spent an hour at the bottom, simply experiencing the environment. The air was cool but not cold, perhaps 53 degrees. The walls were damp but not wet. Most importantly, the temperature was absolutely stable. While the surface temperature varied 20 degrees between morning and afternoon, the bottom of the shaft never changed. He emerged with a complete understanding of what he needed to build. Not a root cellar, not a storage pit, but a proper chamber, deep enough to reach stable earth temperature, large enough to serve as living space, and integrated into his cabin in a way that would allow him to access it quickly if the fire failed. Caddock made his announcement in late May at Rhys Cadwallader's cabin during an informal gathering of trappers. 7 men had assembled to discuss the upcoming season, trade information about beaver populations, and share news from their scattered camps. It was the largest group Caddock had seen since his father's death, and he chose the moment deliberately. If he was going to face mockery, better to face it all at once and be done with it. He waited until the conversation reached a natural pause, then spoke clearly. He intended to dig a chamber beneath his cabin floor, 8 feet deep, 8 feet in diameter, lined with stone. It would be accessed through a hatch built into the floor itself, with a permanent ladder for descent. He would stock it with supplies and use it as both storage and emergency shelter. The earth at that depth maintained a constant temperature around 50 degrees, warm enough to prevent freezing even if the cabin fire died completely. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 5 seconds. Then, Emrys Powell laughed, a sharp bark of disbelief that broke whatever spell had held the room. "You are digging a grave, boy. You are planning to spend your summer digging a hole in the ground when you should be running trap lines and building up supplies for winter. That is the most foolish thing I have heard from anyone in 10 years of mountain living." Gareth Llewellyn shook his head. "The boy thinks he knows better than men who have survived 20 winters out here. Your father kept you alive, Caddock, but Griffith is gone now, and you are showing why boys do not survive alone. A cabin is protection enough if you manage your fire properly. What you are describing is wasted effort." Idris Bevan, the former miner, looked at Caddock with something closer to pity than contempt. "I understand what you are thinking, lad. I work deep. Mines in Wales. I know the earth stays warm below the frost line, but digging beneath a cabin floor is dangerous. The structure could collapse. Water will flood it come spring. And even if you build it sound, you will spend 3 months of work for something you will likely never need." Only Rhys Cadwallader remained quiet, studying Caddock with thoughtful eyes. The old trapper had survived more winters than anyone in the region, and he did not dismiss ideas quickly. After the others had finished their objections, Rhys spoke. "What killed your father, boy?" Caddock met his eyes. Fire went out. Cold took him. Rhys nodded slowly. "And you think hiding in a hole will solve that?" Caddock shook his head. "Not hiding. Having a place where cold cannot reach, where fire is not needed, where warmth is constant." The old man considered this, then shrugged. "It is your summer to waste, but when you realize the foolishness of it and need help running your trapline properly, come find me." The others nodded. Agreement, the matter settled in their minds. The boy would start digging, realize the impossibility of the task, and abandon it within a week. Caddock thanked them for their thoughts and left. He would start in the morning, June 1st, 1837. Caddock stood inside his cabin with a shovel, a pickaxe, and a decision to make about exactly where to dig. The cabin measured 12 feet by 14 feet. The fireplace occupied the northeast corner. His sleeping platform ran along the east wall. His father's old platform, which he had dismantled for lumber, had been on the west wall. The door was centered on the south wall. That left the northwest corner and the central floor space as possible locations. He chose the northwest corner for practical reasons. It was farthest from the door, which meant the hatch would not interfere with daily traffic. It was away from the fireplace, reducing any risk of the chamber filling with smoke. And it positioned the chamber beneath the strongest part of the cabin structure, where the corner logs provided maximum support for the floor above. Caddock marked a circle 8 feet in diameter using a piece of charcoal tied to a string. The circle looked enormous once drawn, consuming nearly a quarter of the cabin's total floor space. He rechecked his measurements twice, then committed. He drove the shovel into the dirt floor and began removing earth. The first day was deceptive. The soil was loose and came up easily. He dug down 18 inches and removed perhaps 30 buckets of dirt, hauling each one outside and dumping it in a pile behind the cabin. His hands blistered despite the calluses he had developed from trap work. His back ached. His shoulders burned. But the progress was visible and encouraging. The second day introduced him to clay. At 20 inches down, the soil changed from loose dirt to dense, heavy clay that stuck to the shovel and required real force to break apart. His progress slowed to half the previous day's rate. He managed another foot of depth, but only by working from dawn until dark with minimal breaks. The third day brought rock, not bedrock, which would have ended the project, but a layer of stones ranging from fist-sized to as large as his head, all embedded in the clay like teeth in a jaw. He switched to the pickaxe, breaking apart clay to expose each stone, then prying the rocks free and hauling them out. Some he could lift alone. Others required him to rig a rope system to drag them up and out of the developing pit. By the end of the first week, he had reached 4 feet of depth. The work was brutally hard. His entire body hurt in ways he had not known were possible. His hands bled despite wrapping them with cloth. He had lost weight he could not afford to lose, and he was not even halfway to his target depth. Cadfael, his dog, watched from the edge of the pit with an expression that Caddock interpreted as concern. The animal had been his father's dog originally, a large mixed breed with wolf ancestry that had bonded to Caddock after Griffith's death. Now the dog spent hours each day lying at the rim of the expanding hole, occasionally whining when Caddock stayed down too long without emerging. The isolation was absolute. No trappers visited. No one checked on his progress. He worked alone with only Cadfael for company, and the silence became its own form of pressure. The fourth week brought Caddock to 6 feet of depth, and the character of the work changed. The hole was now deep enough that he could no longer simply toss dirt out with a shovel. He had to haul every bucket up, using a rope, fill it at the bottom, climb the rope himself to pull it over the edge, then descend again to repeat the process. Each bucket took 5 minutes. Each foot of additional depth required approximately 40 buckets. The walls wanted to collapse. Clay sections would dry and crack, then slump inward when he struck them with the shovel. He learned to work in a careful pattern, shaving the walls smooth and slightly angled outward at the top to reduce the weight pressing down. It was slow, meticulous work that felt nothing like the simple digging he had imagined. At 7 feet down, he hit water, not a flood, but a steady seepage that pooled at the bottom and turned the clay into slippery mud. This was the problem Idris Bevan had warned about, the reason most people said underground chambers would not work. Caddock stopped digging and spent 3 days solving the drainage issue. He started by digging a sump hole in the center of the chamber floor, 2 feet deeper than the main floor level. Then he filled it with rocks of graduated sizes, largest at the bottom, smallest at the top, creating a French drain that would collect water and allow it to seep slowly into the earth below rather than pooling on the floor. Around the perimeter of the chamber, he dug a shallow channel that sloped toward the sump, giving water a path to follow. The system worked. Water that seeped from the walls ran down to the channel, followed the slope to the sump, and disappeared into the rock fill. The main floor area remained dry enough to work on. It was not perfect, but it was functional, and Caddock understood that perfection was not possible. He was working with earth and water, elements that followed their own rules. His job was to work with those rules, not against them. By mid-July, he reached 8 feet of depth. The floor of the chamber was now level, roughly circular, approximately 8 feet across. The walls were vertical clay, smoothed as well as he could manage with limited tools. The temperature at the bottom was noticeably cooler than the surface, even on hot summer days, and Caddock verified it with a thermometer he had inherited from his father. 53 degrees, constant regardless of the time of day or weather conditions above. He climbed out and stood looking down at what he had created. It was a hole, nothing more yet, but it proved. The concept was possible. The earth did stay cool. The drainage did work. The walls had not collapsed. Now came the harder part, turning a functional hole into a chamber that could preserve his life. The chamber walls were functional but temporary. Clay would eventually crumble, especially with the constant moisture seepage and the freeze-thaw cycles that would occur at the interface between deep earth and cabin floor. Caddock needed something permanent, and that meant stone. He had studied Idris Bevan's stone-lined cellar carefully, noting how the fitted rocks distributed pressure evenly and prevented collapse, while also managing moisture better than raw earth. Finding suitable stone took 2 weeks. He needed flat pieces that would stack well, roughly rectangular in shape, large enough to be structural, but small enough for him to handle alone. He found them in a creek bed 3 miles from the cabin, water-smoothed sandstone and limestone that had broken from cliff faces upstream and tumbled smooth over centuries. He hauled them back using a travois he built from pine poles and leather straps, making 4 trips each day. He laid the first course of stone directly on the chamber floor, setting each piece in clay mortar. He mixed from the same clay he had excavated, adding water to achieve a thick paste. The stones needed to be level, which required careful shimming and constant checking with a straight edge. A foundation that started crooked would only get worse as the wall rose. The second course overlapped the first in a running bond pattern, each stone spanning the joint between 2 stones below it. This was basic masonry, knowledge his father had possessed from working on mine structures in Wales, and Griffith had taught Caddock the principles during idle winter evenings. Theory was easier than practice. Each stone needed to be selected for fit, sometimes shaped by striking it carefully with a hammer to break off protruding sections, then set in mortar and checked. For level in all directions. The work was slow. Caddock managed perhaps 2 feet of wall height each week, working course by careful course around the circumference of the chamber. The mortar needed time to cure between courses or the weight would squeeze it out and destabilize everything above. He learned patience he had not known he possessed. By early August, the stone walls reached 5 feet high. The structure had taken shape. The chamber now resembled a well rather than a hole, with solid stone walls that would last decades, if not centuries. Caddock worked inside the space, and the enclosed feeling was both comforting and slightly claustrophobic. The walls pressed close. The ceiling, still open to the cabin above, seemed far away. He left gaps every few feet where stones did not quite meet, creating weep holes that would allow moisture from behind the wall to drain through rather than building pressure. This was critical. Pressure from saturated earth could push even good stonework inward. The weep holes, combined with his drainage system, gave water multiple paths to escape. The final courses required him to angle the stone slightly inward, creating a gentle taper that would help support the wooden hatch he would eventually install. The top course needed to be perfectly level and even, providing a solid bearing surface. The hatch was the most critical component of the entire project. It needed to support the weight of anyone walking across that section of cabin floor, which meant supporting Caddock's weight plus any supplies or furniture that might be placed above it. It needed to seal well enough to prevent drafts, but open easily enough to be used in an emergency. And it needed to be integrated structurally so that it became part of the floor rather than a weak point that could collapse. Caddock started with measurements. The stone wall's interior diameter was exactly 8 feet. He needed the hatch to rest on the stone with at least 3 inches of bearing. Surface all around, which meant the hatch needed to be 8 feet 6 inches in diameter. That was larger than any single piece of wood he could obtain. The hatch would need to be assembled from multiple pieces. He selected 6 planks from a pine tree he felled specifically for this purpose. Each plank was 3 inches thick, 12 inches wide, and 9 feet long. He shaped them using a draw knife his father had owned, working the surfaces flat and smooth. The edges needed to be straight and true so the planks would fit together without gaps. The assembly method took him 3 days to devise. He laid the planks parallel, edges touching, then cut 2 circular arcs from additional planks to serve as cross braces. These arcs followed the curve of the hatch circle and were mortised into the underside of each plank, locking them together into a single unit. He secured the mortise joints with wooden pegs driven tight. Then came the reinforcement. He had saved 2 iron straps from his father's equipment, each 3 feet long and 3 inches wide. He heated them in the fireplace until they were malleable, then shaped them into gentle curves that would follow the hatch's circumference. He bolted these through the planks, creating iron bands that bound the wood together and distributed weight across the entire structure. The completed hatch weighed nearly 80 pounds. It took all of Caddick's strength to maneuver it into position over the chamber opening. He lowered it carefully onto the stone wall, checking that it sat level and had even bearing all around. The fit was tight but workable. He could lift one edge and pivot the hatch open, swinging it up and propping it against the cabin wall. For the final detail, he cut a rope handle into the surface, a carved groove that allowed him to get his fingers underneath and lift. The handle was positioned off-center, so the hatch would naturally want to swing in one direction, making it easier to open consistently. He tested the hatch by standing on it, then jumping. The structure held solid. He placed heavy rocks on it, simulating furniture weight. No deflection, no creaking. The hatch had become part of the floor, indistinguishable from the surrounding dirt surface, except for the circular seam. Access required a permanent ladder. Caddick considered rope, which would be easier to install, but rope would rot and could fail when he needed it most. He needed something solid, something that would last as long as the stone walls. He built a ladder from oak, the densest hardwood he could find in the surrounding forest. The side rails were 6-inch square timbers, 8 feet long, shaped with an adze until they were straight and smooth. The rungs were 2-inch diameter oak branches, seasoned and stripped of bark. He drilled holes through the side rails at 12-inch intervals and drove the rungs through, securing each with wooden wedges that would swell with moisture and lock tight. Installing the ladder required precision. He needed it to be vertical, but also positioned so it did not interfere with the shelving he planned to build. He mortised the top of the side rails into a beam that spanned the chamber opening, creating a permanent anchor point. The bottom of the ladder rested on the stone floor, and he carved slight depressions in the floor stones to keep the rails from sliding. The shelving system was equally important. A chamber without storage was just an empty hole. Caddick needed space for food, water, firewood, medical supplies, tools, and anything else that might be required for survival. He designed a shelving system that wrapped around 2/3 of the chamber's circumference, leaving the ladder area and a small floor space open. He built the shelves from split pine planks mounted on oak brackets. The brackets were mortised into gaps he had left in the stone walls during construction, creating anchor points that transferred the shelf weight directly to the structural wall, rather than relying on fasteners that might pull free. Each shelf was 18 inches deep and spaced 14 inches apart vertically, giving him 4 levels of storage. The bottom shelf sat 2 feet above the floor, high enough to stay dry even if his drainage system failed and water pooled. The top shelf ended a foot below the chamber ceiling, leaving clearance for anyone standing in the space. The total storage capacity was substantial, perhaps 60 square feet of shelf surface. He organized the space methodically. Bottom shelf for heavy items like water containers and firewood. Second shelf for preserved foods in jars and crocks. Third shelf for dry goods, blankets, and clothing. Top shelf for tools, medical supplies, and items he would need to access quickly. Each item had a designated position, and Caddick practiced retrieving things in darkness, training himself to find what he needed by touch alone. The chamber was taking shape. What had been a hole was now a functional space, stone-walled and dry, equipped with solid access and organized storage. It no longer looked like a grave. It looked like engineering. The drainage system Caddick had built during excavation worked adequately for normal conditions, but he understood that adequate was not sufficient. Spring snowmelt would send water through the ground in quantities far beyond what his simple rock-filled sump could handle. A major storm could saturate the earth around the chamber and turn the space into a well. He needed a drainage solution that would work under the worst possible conditions. He started by expanding the sump system. The original sump was 2 feet deep and 18 inches in diameter. He dug it deeper, down to 10 feet and wider, creating a column of drainage that extended well below the chamber floor. He filled it with carefully graded stone, placing the largest rocks at the bottom where water pressure would be greatest, then progressively smaller stones as he worked upward, finishing with gravel at the top. The graded stone created multiple pathways for water to percolate downward, while the smaller materials prevented the larger voids from filling with silt and clay that would eventually clog the system. It was the same principle miners used in deep shafts, and Kadok had read about it in his father's mining manual. Theory matched practice. When he poured a bucket of water into the sump, it disappeared in seconds. Around the chamber perimeter, he improved his original channel system. He dug the channels deeper, a full 6 inches down, and lined them with flat stones to prevent erosion. The channels sloped consistently toward the sump at a grade of approximately 1 inch per foot, enough to move water reliably but not so steep that it would cause erosion. At 4 points around the chamber, he installed what the mining manual called French drains. These were holes dug through the chamber floor into the earth below, filled with stone, and connected to the perimeter. Channels. They provided additional drainage capacity and multiple paths for water to escape if the main sump became overwhelmed. The final element was managing water that might run down the stone walls themselves. He carved small channels into the mortar joints between stones, creating vertical paths that directed wall seepage downward to the floor channels, rather than allowing it to pool on the shelves or drip into the chamber space. The channels were barely visible, just slight grooves in the mortar, but they made a measurable difference. To test the system, Kadok hauled 20 buckets of water into the chamber and poured them against the walls, simulating heavy seepage. The water ran down the stone faces, followed the carved channels to the floor, flowed along the perimeter channels to the sump, and disappeared. The floor remained dry, no pooling, no standing water, no indication that the system was overwhelmed. He tested it again during a heavy August rainstorm, descending into the chamber while rain pounded the cabin above. Water seeped through in dozens of small trickles, but every trickle found a path to the drainage system and was carried away. The chamber stayed dry and habitable. Fresh air was essential for human survival, but every opening that admitted air also allowed heat to escape. This was the paradox Kadok needed to solve. A sealed chamber would maintain its temperature perfectly, but would become unbreathable within hours. An open chamber would have fresh air, but would quickly equilibrate to whatever temperature existed in the cabin above, defeating the entire purpose of the underground space. He studied the problem from multiple angles. Mines had ventilation systems, but they relied on mechanical air movement, fans or pumps that forced fresh air down and stale air up. He had no such equipment and no way to power it. Natural ventilation relied on temperature differences, creating convection currents, but that required openings at different heights, and his chamber had only one access point at the top. The solution came from observing how air moved in caves. He had explored several small caves in the surrounding hills and noticed that even deep caves had airflow. The air was not stagnant, despite having limited openings. The flow was driven by subtle temperature differences and by changes in atmospheric pressure that pushed fresh air in and pulled stale air out. Kadok designed a dual vent system built into the hatch itself. He drilled 2 holes through the thick wood, each 3 inches in diameter, positioned on opposite sides of the circular hatch. One hole was fitted with a downward-facing tube that extended 6 inches below the hatch level, drawing air from the chamber. The other hole was fitted with an upward-facing tube that extended 6 inches above the hatch level, admitting air from the cabin. The tubes were carved from solid wood and fitted tightly into the drilled holes. The downward tube had small holes drilled near its bottom end, allowing air to enter from the chamber. The upward tube had holes near its top end, allowing cabin air to enter and flow down into the chamber. The configuration created a natural circulation pattern driven by convection. Warm air from the chamber would rise through the downward tube and exit into the cabin. Cooler air from the cabin would sink through the upward tube and enter the chamber. The flow would be slow but continuous, providing enough air exchange to prevent suffocation while moving slowly enough that temperature transfer was minimal. To test the system, Caddock sealed himself in the chamber with the hatch closed and the vents operating. He brought a candle to monitor oxygen levels. If the air became too stale, the candle would gutter and die before he was in danger. He stayed below for 4 hours, and the candle burned steadily the entire time. The air remained breathable, though slightly cooler and damper than the cabin air above. He refined the system by adding small wooden caps to each vent tube. The caps could be rotated to partially or fully close the vents, allowing him to control airflow based on conditions. In summer, he could open the vents fully to maximize cooling. In winter, he could restrict them to minimize heat loss while still maintaining adequate air exchange. September brought the first serious cold, nights dropping below freezing, and mornings white with frost. Caddock shifted his focus from construction to preparation. The chamber was complete structurally, but an empty chamber provided no survival advantage. He needed to stock it with everything required to sustain life if the cabin above became uninhabitable. Food was the primary concern. He had spent the summer trapping when not working on the chamber, and he had a modest collection of beaver pelts to trade. He took them to Fort Union in early September and converted them into supplies specifically chosen for underground storage: dried beans, salt pork, hardtack, cornmeal, salt, sugar, coffee, and dried apples. Foods that would not spoil and required minimal preparation. He bought 20 glass jars with sealed lids and spent a week preserving vegetables from the wild plants growing near the cabin: wild onions, cattail roots, mushrooms he had dried in the sun, and berries packed in sugar. Each jar was labeled with its contents and stored on the second shelf where he could inventory them easily. Water required careful thought. He could not store enough water for extended survival, but he could store enough for several days. He filled 6 earthenware crocks with fresh water from the creek and sealed them with wax-dipped cloth. The cool chamber temperature would keep the water fresh for months if needed. Firewood seemed counterintuitive for an underground space, but Caddock included it anyway, not for heat, but for light and cooking. He cut pine into short lengths that would fit in a small fire pit he had built in one corner of the chamber, with a chimney made from hollow logs extending up through a second hole in the hatch. The chimney would vent smoke without requiring the main hatch to be open. Blankets and spare clothing filled one section of the third shelf. 2 heavy wool blankets, a spare coat, extra socks, and a change of clothes sealed in an oiled leather bag to protect them from moisture. Medical supplies occupied another section: bandages, a needle and thread for stitches, whiskey for disinfecting wounds, and a small kit of basic medicines. Tools were essential: a knife, a hatchet, a small shovel, rope, and a tinderbox for starting fires. He also stored his father's rifle and ammunition, wrapped carefully in oiled cloth to prevent rust. The rifle might be needed if he had to remain below ground during a threat from animals or hostile humans. By late October, the chamber was fully provisioned. Caddock made a final inventory, checking every item and recording its location in a small notebook he kept in the chamber. The list was comprehensive. He could survive below ground for 2 weeks with the supplies he had stored, possibly longer if he rationed carefully. The chamber no longer felt like a construction project. It felt like insurance, a guarantee that cold or fire or any other disaster would not kill him the way it had killed his father. October brought an early cold snap, temperatures plummeting overnight from mild autumn weather to winter conditions. Caddock woke on the morning of October 23rd to find ice crusted on the inside of the cabin window and his breath visible in the pre-dawn darkness. The fire had burned low during the night, though not dangerously so. He added wood and coaxed it back to full heat, but the sudden cold gave him an idea. He had built the chamber, provisioned it, and tested individual systems, but he had never tested the core concept. He had never verified that the chamber would actually keep him alive. if the cabin fire failed completely. The mathematics and theory suggested it would work, but Caddick had learned through hard experience that theory and practice were not always aligned. He needed to know with certainty. That evening he let the fire die completely. He did not bank it for overnight burning. He simply stopped feeding it and watched as the flames diminished to coals, then to ash, then to nothing. The cabin temperature began dropping immediately. Within an hour he could see his breath. Within 2 hours, the cold was seeping through his clothes. By the time full darkness arrived, the cabin was perhaps 30 degrees inside, cold enough to be genuinely uncomfortable. Caddick gathered a blanket, a candle, his notebook, and Cadful. He opened the hatch and descended into the chamber with the dog, following carefully down the ladder. He closed the hatch above them, sealing them into the underground space, and lit the candle to provide light. Then he simply waited, monitoring the temperature with his father's thermometer and recording observations in his notebook. The chamber temperature when he entered was 54 degrees. He noted the time, 8 o'clock in the evening. He wrapped himself in the blanket and sat on the floor with his back against the stone wall. Cadful curled up beside him, the dog's body heat adding minor warmth. The candle provided a small amount of additional heat, though Caddick tried to account for that in his observations. Over the next 6 hours, the chamber temperature dropped by 1 degree, settling at 53 degrees where it remained stable. The cabin above, he knew, would be well below freezing by now. The overnight low outside was predicted to reach 15 degrees. But here, 8 feet underground, the temperature held absolutely steady. His body heat, the dog's warmth, and the candle's small contribution were balanced by the Earth's constant thermal mass. Caddick was not warm exactly. 53 degrees was cool enough to be uncomfortable without proper insulation, but he was not cold in any dangerous sense. Wrapped in the wool blanket with Cadful pressed against his side, he was maintaining body temperature easily. He could stay here indefinitely without risk of hypothermia. He dozed intermittently, waking to check the thermometer and add observations to his notebook. At first light, he climbed back into the cabin. The interior was viciously cold, perhaps 20 degrees. Frost covered every surface. January 1838 arrived with weather that old trappers would talk about for decades. A massive cold front swept down from Canada, driven by winds that carved snow into sculptured drifts and dropped temperatures to levels that killed exposed livestock and forced even experienced frontiersmen to remain sheltered for days. The cold settled over the Rocky Mountain region like a physical weight, and it did not lift. Caddick had prepared carefully. He had enough firewood split and stacked to last a month. His food supplies were adequate. The cabin was as weatherproof as standard construction allowed. But on January 7th, the temperature dropped to 40 degrees below zero, and it stayed there. The cold was not a temporary snap that would pass in a day or two. It was sustained, brutal, and unrelenting. The cabin fire required constant attention. Caddick fed it every hour during daylight and twice during the night. The fireplace consumed wood at an alarming rate, and even with continuous burning, the cabin temperature barely reached 40 degrees. The walls were thick with frost on the interior. Water froze in its bucket within minutes of being brought inside. His food supplies, stored in the cabin, began freezing solid. On the night of January 12th, he made a decision. The fire was adequate to prevent immediate death, but it was marginal, and he was exhausting himself maintaining it. He moved half his supplies into the chamber and began spending his nights below ground. The routine became simple. Maintain the cabin fire during daylight hours, then descend into the chamber at dusk with Cadful, sleep in relative comfort at 52 degrees, and emerge at dawn to rebuild the fire. The difference was dramatic. Underground, he slept soundly, instead of waking constantly to tend fire. His body recovered instead of fighting perpetual cold. He consumed less firewood because the chamber required no heating at all. The chamber's stable temperature also protected his food supplies from freezing, which meant he could eat normally rather than chipping frozen pemmican with a knife. By the fourth night of this routine, Caddock understood something profound. The chamber was not emergency backup. It was superior to the cabin for winter survival. The cabin required constant work to maintain barely adequate warmth. The chamber required no work and provided consistent, reliable protection. He had built what he intended as insurance, but he had actually built something better than the standard solution. The cold persisted. Through mid-January, 10 consecutive days of temperatures below -30, with several nights reaching -40. Caddock survived comfortably, spending nights in the chamber and days managing minimal fire in the cabin. His firewood consumption was half what it would have been trying to heat the cabin adequately for sleeping. On January 15th, he had a visitor, or rather, he heard a serious pounding on his cabin door near midnight. He was already in the chamber preparing for sleep when the sound reached him through 8 feet of earth and the closed hatch. The pounding was desperate, the sound of fists hitting wood with the urgency of someone in genuine crisis. Caddock climbed the ladder quickly, pushed open the hatch, and crossed the frozen cabin to the door. He lifted the bar and pulled it open. Gareth Llewellyn stood in the doorway, coatless, his face white with cold, shaking so violently he could barely stand. Behind him, the night was clear and utterly still, the kind of cold that froze moisture in the air and made stars look sharp enough to cut. Gareth tried to speak, but his jaw would not work properly. He stumbled forward and Caddock caught him, half carrying the man to the fireplace. The cabin fire had burned down to coals, but it was still warmer than outside. Caddock added wood quickly, building the fire back to flames, then turned to assess the damage. Gareth's hands were gray-white, early frostbite setting in. His feet were in similar condition. He was coherent enough to be conscious, but deteriorating quickly. "What happened?" Caddock asked, though he already understood. "Fire died," Gareth managed through chattering teeth. "Could not get it restarted. Tried for an hour, too cold. Fingers stopped working. Came here, your cabin closest." The man's eyes focused on Caddock with desperate hope. "Please, need warmth. We'll lose fingers if not." Caddock made a decision instantly. The cabin fire would help, but not quickly enough. Gareth needed sustained warmth. Immediately, and the only place that offered that was 8 feet below ground. He helped Gareth to the hatch, supported him down the ladder, and wrapped him in every blanket stored in the chamber. Then he climbed back up, built up the cabin fire to ensure it would last, and descended again with hot coals in an iron pot. The chamber temperature was 53 degrees, which felt warm compared to the air Gareth had been breathing. Caddock placed the pot of coals in the small fire pit he had built, adding minimal airflow to make them glow without flaming. The radiant heat raised the chamber temperature to perhaps 58 degrees, and combined with the blankets, it was enough. Gareth's shaking gradually subsided. Color returned to his face. His hands, immersed in water Caddock had warmed with the coals, regained feeling with obvious pain that made the man gasp. They stayed in the chamber for the remainder of the night. Gareth sat wrapped in blankets, slowly recovering, while Caddock monitored him for signs of serious frostbite or hypothermia. Cadful lay between them, the dog's presence somehow making the underground space feel less strange. Gareth looked around the chamber with growing comprehension, seeing the stone walls, the organized shelves, the drainage channels, the careful construction of everything. "You built this," he said finally. "They all mocked you. I mocked you, called it foolish, said you were wasting your summer." His voice was rough with emotion that had nothing to do with cold. "You built this and it saved my life tonight." Word of Gareth Llewellyn's survival traveled through the scattered trapping community with the speed that important news always moved on the frontier. Men who lived miles apart and saw each other rarely still managed to communicate essential information, and the story of how a boy's underground chamber had saved a freezing man's life was essential. By early February, every trapper within 20 miles of Caddock's cabin knew what had happened. Emrys Powell arrived first on a cold, clear morning 3 weeks after Gareth's rescue. He did not apologize directly for his mockery. That was not the way of frontier men, but he asked detailed questions about construction methods with a respect that had been absent from previous conversations. How deep did you dig? How did you prevent collapse? What did you use for the wall lining? How does the drainage work? Caddock answered each question thoroughly, and Emrys took notes in a small leather journal. A week later, Emrys returned with a request that clearly cost him pride to make. "Would you come to my cabin and help me build one? I will provide all labor and materials. I need your knowledge of how to do it correctly." Caddock agreed without hesitation. They spent 2 weeks constructing a chamber beneath Emrys's cabin floor, working together in a partnership that transformed their relationship from skeptic and fool to teacher and student. Idris Bevan came next, the former Welsh miner who had warned Caddock about the dangers of underground construction. Bevan was more technically knowledgeable than most trappers, and his questions focused on specific engineering details. The drainage system particularly interested him, and he spent hours examining how Caddock had solved the water seepage problem. "I was wrong about the feasibility," Bevan admitted. "I thought frontier conditions made this impossible. You proved that careful construction overcomes the obstacles. I would like to build something similar." Rhys Cadwallader, the eldest trapper, visited in March as the worst of winter began easing. The old man descended into the chamber with some difficulty, his aging joints protesting the latter, but he insisted on seeing the work firsthand. He stood in the underground space for a long time, running his hands over the stone walls, examining the shelving, testing the floor drainage. Finally he spoke. "I have survived 34 winters in these mountains. I have seen men die from cold, fire failure, bear attacks, accidents, and simple bad luck. What you have built here addresses the most common killer, a place where fire is not needed and cold cannot reach. This is worth spreading." Over the following months, 6 more trappers asked Caddock to help them build chambers beneath their cabins. He agreed to all requests, traveling to distant camps and sharing his knowledge freely. Each chamber was slightly different based on local soil conditions and available materials, but the core principles remained constant. Dig deep enough to reach stable earth temperature, line the walls with stone, install proper drainage, create adequate ventilation, build a strong hatch that integrates with the floor structure. The technique that trappers began calling bunker cabins spread throughout the northern Rocky Mountain region over the following decade. Not every frontiersman adopted it. Some still considered the effort excessive. Others lacked the skill or patience for the careful construction required. But those who faced serious winter conditions or who had experienced close calls with fire failure understood the value. By 1845, an estimated 30 bunker cabins existed across Montana and Wyoming territories. The innovation saved lives in ways both dramatic and quiet. During the harsh winter of 1842, a blizzard trapped 3 trappers in a cabin for 9 days. Their firewood ran out on day 6. They survived the final 3 days in their underground chamber, emerging when the storm cleared. In 1847, a cabin fire started by a knocked-over lantern destroyed a trapper's home while he sheltered safely below ground with his supplies intact. The examples accumulated, undramatic individual instances that collectively represented dozens of people who lived because they had a place to go when surface conditions became lethal. Caddock himself continued trapping until 1844, when the collapse of the furs trade forced most mountain men to seek other livelihoods. He moved to the Oregon Territory and established a small ranch near Salem. He married in 1846 a woman named Elizabeth, who had come west with a wagon train. They had 4 children over the following decade, and Caddock built them a solid home using the construction principles he had learned in the mountains. He never spoke much about his time as a trapper. His children knew their father had lived in the Rockies as a young man, but they did not know about the chamber beneath the cabin or the winter that had killed his father. Caddock did not hide the information, he simply did not volunteer it. The past was past, and his focus was on building a future for his family. He died in 1891 at age 68, passing quietly in his sleep after a brief illness. His obituary in the Salem newspaper described him as a rancher and carpenter who had contributed to the community through steady work and honest dealing. There was no mention of frontier innovations or lives saved through engineering. But in the mountains of Montana, his original cabin still stood. Settlers moving west discovered it in the 1850s and recognized the quality of construction. The cabin changed hands several times, always valued for its solid building and unusual features. The underground chamber remained functional, still dry, still maintaining its constant temperature. Later owners used it for food storage, understanding that it kept vegetables and preserved goods better than any surface structure. In 1912, a historian researching frontier architecture documented the cabin and traced its origins back to Caddock Pritchard. The chamber beneath the floor was noted as an unusually sophisticated example of frontier engineering, though its purpose as emergency shelter had been forgotten. It was simply remembered as exceptional construction by someone who understood how to build for survival.